Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking biochemistry. So biochemistry is just a really fancy name that describes the molecules that makes up things like our food. Because you've heard of stuff like sugar and fat and protein. Well, that's all biochemistry. That's all what we're going to call organic compounds. There are four types of these organic compounds that make up what I call biochemistry. One are the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. Now these are large molecules. They're sometimes referred to as macromolecules in terms of their size, which means that they're going to be made up of smaller molecules. You're going to need to know what those smaller molecules are that make up these larger macromolecules. So let's get started with carbohydrates. These are better known as the sugars. Their monomer, or their building block, if you will, that makes up all carbohydrates is something called the monosaccharide. So if we break that word down, mono means one, the saccharide part refers to sweet. And so here is an example of a monosaccharide. So the one on your left, you can see where all the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens are. The one on the right is more of a simpler way of showing the molecule that you see on the left. And if I were to write this out, we would count that there are 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So that C6H12O6 tells us that this is a type of monosaccharide. Here are a few other examples. We're going to be focusing primarily on these two throughout the year: glucose and fructose, both of which are very commonly found in everyday types of foods, and these are sugars that our bodies use on a regular basis. Now if we take two of these monosaccharides and we put them together, like say we take that glucose and fructose, we form what's called a disaccharide. Di means two. You're very familiar with this molecule. This is sucrose. What's sucrose, you say? It's sugar. Yeah, the type of sugar that you buy in the grocery store is a type of disaccharide. Now what if we start putting a whole bunch of these monosaccharides together? Well, then we form what is called a polysaccharide. Poly means many. And these are just some that you might be familiar with. Starch, which is how plants store their extra glucose. Glycogen, which is how animals store their excess glucose. And then there's cellulose. Cellulose is found in plants, and we more commonly refer to this as fiber. Now if you take a look at starch and glycogen, they kind of look a little bit alike. It looks very different from cellulose. For humans, we can break down starch and glycogen if we eat it. If we eat plants that have cellulose, we can't break that down. So a few places where we can find these polysaccharides: starch, of course, is in things like breads and grains, pastas. Cellulose we can find in places like wood. Now there's one thing I want you to remember about carbohydrates, and that is what their function is. Their function is to provide energy. All living things need to have carbohydrates as their main energy source. Most of the fuel that we use on a daily basis is coming from carbohydrates. The second type of organic compounds are the lipids. These are better known as the fats. And they are made up of two smaller molecules, the glycerol and fatty acids. And on our molecule, the part here that is in the dark gray, made up of, we count them 1, 2, 3 carbon atoms, that is the glycerol portion of the molecule. And then these 3 long chains, those are the fatty acids. So unlike in carbohydrates that only had 1 monomer, lipids have 2. What do lipids do for us? Well, their primary function is to store energy. So when we eat too much and we don't use up all those calories that day, our body decides to take all that and it stores it in the form of fat. It also is acting as a heat insulator. So here you can see in this diagram the adipocytes, otherwise known as the fat cells, that can be stored just below the skin. The third type of organic compound are the proteins. Their building blocks are called the amino acids. And if you take a look, their building blocks are called the amino acids. And here we have an example of an amino acid. It is made up of a centralized carbon. We have what's called an NH2 group That's the amine group. We have the COOH group. That's what's known as an acid group, hence the name amino acid. There's a hydrogen, but then there is this, we see a letter R there. That could be anything. And this is what makes the amino acids different from one another. Everything else is the same except for this R group right here. So what do they look like? Well, they could look like this. In alanine, there's the R group. There's the R group in valine, in leucine, and so on. So I'm only showing you 6 different molecules here, but there's actually 20 different amino acids. And our cells will take these amino acids and it will start to build proteins. And when it builds those proteins, it has to make sure that these amino acids are in the right sequence. So it begins building these proteins, and it forms this long chain of amino acids. This is what we would call a polypeptide. Poly means many, pep refers to proteins. Now if we take a bunch of these polypeptides and we put them together, we create this weird shaped structure like this. This is a protein. So in this, it looks like they're color coding these, so we have 4 different polypeptides making this particular protein. Now proteins will do a variety of things for us. One is they're the basic structural materials for all living organisms. When you think about a human, we're mostly made up of protein. Our hair is protein, our skin is protein, our muscles are protein. There's protein everywhere in our bodies. Makes enzymes and hormones which control metabolism. We'll be taking a look at enzymes in a future video, but along with hormones, they play a very important role in helping us to maintain our homeostasis. The last organic compounds are the nucleic acids. In a nucleic acid, they are made up of a smaller building block or monomer called a nucleotide. Here you can see a nucleotide in the diagram. And there are 3 parts to this nucleotide. We have a sugar. This is a type of monosaccharide. We have what's called a phosphate group. And in every nucleotide, the phosphate group and the sugar are the same. The one thing that's different is what is known as the base. There are 5 different types of nucleotides based on the bases that they have. We have adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, and uracil. So here you can see what each of those bases look like. This is why we just use a rectangle to represent those off of that sugar molecule, which is the one that looks like the home plate. Now we have around 100,000 different types of proteins found in the human body, but there's only 2 types of nucleic acids. I'm sure you've heard of these too. There's DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, ribonucleic acid. What do they do for us? Well, they do a lot of things. They control all of our cell activities. Everything that's happening inside the cell is being regulated by your DNA. It stores all of our hereditary information, so all that information that makes you who you are is stored in your DNA, and it will allow you to pass that on to your children. And it is going to ultimately make all of the proteins, and we'll spend a whole lot of time talking about how that happens. So that's just a quick overview on the 4 types of organic compounds. This is something though that we are going to be talking about in just about every unit from here on out. So it's very important that you know what they are, what they look like, what their functions are, and what makes them up. We'll be spending some time in class practicing that, and I'll see you there.